Hi everyone, it's Father Olek here, and I'm delighted to be here with Professor Tracey Rowland. Welcome,
Thank
Professor
you.
Rowland. Now, Tracey holds the St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. She completed her PhD in Cambridge, then her STL and STD at the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome. She was a member of the International Theological Commission and is currently a member of the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences. And in 2020, you received the Ratzinger Prize, which is, I would say, analogous to a Nobel Prize in theology. So it's a great privilege to be with you here this morning. But your most recent publication, which I found very encouraging, inspiring, is your Introducing Communio Theology. Now, this was published last year by Word on Fire Press. It's a beautiful production, and I highly recommend people to go out and buy this. Now, just to begin with, what was the context of your writing of the book?
Well, some of the publishers at Word on Fire actually approached me with the idea of writing it, and so I can't claim it was my idea. But the young people at Word on Fire are just fantastic. They're super bright, super well educated, devoutly Catholic, and very entrepreneurial. So
tick all the boxes.
So they tick all the boxes, and it was one of their ideas. And I think one of the ideas is simply that it's now been 50 years or 5 decades since the Second Vatican Council, and that means there's a several, or at least 2 post-conciliar generations, if we count a generation as 25 years. And so now we have younger people for whom the Second Vatican Council is like ancient history. They've heard about it, but they don't really know anything in depth. They're very interested in the world of ideas. They're searching for the truth. Bishop Barron has 2 million followers apparently on YouTube. So a lot of the young people are listening to Bishop Barron. Some of them, I think, come into the church because they listen to Jordan Peterson, and he becomes a kind of gateway drug to Bishop Barron. And so they're very interested in the intellectual life of the faith, but they have sort of missed out on 5 decades of intellectual history. So what I try to do in that book is really put together some of the most significant theological work of the last 5 decades from within the Communio tradition. Now, for those who have never heard of the Communio tradition, in its most simple terms, at the Second Vatican Council, there were a number of people who were called periti, the kind of intellectuals, the intellectual people, the scholars, who accompanied the bishops to the council. So most bishops had a theological advisor, and when issues arose on the floor of the council, they would be speaking to their theological advisors. And those advisors, after the end of the Second Vatican Council, they created a journal called Concilium. And their idea was, well, we will continue the theological discussions that took place on the floor of the council in the pages of the journal Concilium, which was a good idea, I think. But then the 60s roll on, and by 1970, there is a congress in Brussels where all the periti get together. It was a huge conference, lots of journalists turned up, and there was an enormous amount of intellectual conflict at that Congress. And it was quite clear that the periti was splitting into different subgroups. And one of the major theological issues was, given that Catholic theology is about a relationship between faith and reason, how do we understand faith and how do we understand reason?
Yes,
You know,
yes.
now that's really seriously fundamental. And when we ask the question, how do we understand reason, we're sort of looking at what are the best philosophical traditions, what are the best approaches to the understanding of reason to partner with theology. And so what happens in the late 1960s is that a number of those periti and a number of key theologians in Europe, but especially in Germany and Belgium, they start getting interested in critical theory, in Frankfurt School social theories. They get interested in Marxist social theories, and they sort of go off on this project of partnering Catholic theology with these contemporary social theories. And that becomes a major issue in the Congress. And there's sort of a parting of the ways, as it were.
Sure.
And so in 1972, a new journal is created. It's called Communio. And the leaders of that, the founders of that, are Henri de Lubac, the French Jesuit, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, who was a Swiss theologian, who was initially a Jesuit, but he left the Society of Jesus to set up his own new ecclesial movement, but remained a priest and a theologian. And the third name, Joseph Ratzinger, who becomes Pope Benedict. So they set up the Communio Journal as an alternative to the Concilium Journal, and it ended up being published in some 12 different language editions around the world. And each of those different language traditions publishes, there are 4 volumes a year. 3 volumes are sort of common in the sense that the same articles are published in different languages, but at least 1 volume a year is sort of completely native to that country or region or linguistic
and
group.
that changes from what that 1 volume changes from country to country or region to region.
Yeah, because different countries have different pastoral issues, you know. Like we don't have a big problem with polygamy
exactly.
in the Anglophone world, but in some parts of the world that's an issue, as one example. So we have this whole body of theology that has developed over the last 5 decades, and it sort of owes its intellectual inspiration very strongly to those 3 men, to de Lubac, to Balthasar, to Ratzinger.
So they arose kind of in contrast during that debate in Brussels in 1971.
In 1970, yes.
Yeah, 1970, sorry.
Yeah.
And they were responding to the issue you mentioned of faith and reason. And it seems like the Concilium were correlating the faith to the philosophical tradition which is current at the time. Would that be a correct kind of reading
I think
of it?
that's a very good explanation. Okay. So I should also have said that in 1968, Pope Paul VI founded the International Theological Commission.
Okay. Which is just after Vatican II.
Yes. And so he founds that commission again so that the best theologians in the world could kind of continue to meet and talk about important issues in the life of the church and produce documents on important theological topics of the day. At the 1969 meeting, already de Lubac and Balthasar,
they're members of the
they're members of the ITC, and they're already thinking maybe we need to do something a bit different. But in 1970 at the Brussels Congress, it sort of, what was already sort of manifesting itself within the International Theological Commission, it becomes kind of just out in the open, and a major issue in 1970. So then in 72, the trio found Communio.
It's interesting, going back to that context of faith and reason and linking it to kind of the Frankfurt School and Marxism. One of the things I hear of a defense of that is, well, St. Thomas Aquinas used a non-Christian in Aristotle as a philosophical kind of handmaiden, for lack of a better expression. Why can't we use Marx? Now, my kind of thinking is, well, sure, but Aristotle was pre-Christian and therefore does not know Christ. Marx is post-Christian, and therefore, if he doesn't have a Christian sense or sensibility, then it must be anti-Christian. Is that?
Yeah. I think that's one of the arguments. I don't think it's the only one. I think you're absolutely right in saying that for many of these people who decided to get involved with critical theory or other social theories of a Marxian pedigree or sometimes Hegelian pedigree, or even they get into psychology and Freudian stuff, their attitude was these ideas are regarded in the secular academies as the most reliable ideas today. And so just as St. Thomas Aquinas took on Aristotelian philosophy in the 13th century, in the 20th century, we need to take on these contemporary social theories. That was the justification. And I think that I would say from the Communio point of view, it's not just that these ideas are post-Christian in the sense of, they've arisen after the incarnation. Like Aristotle was pre-Christian, and he and Plato, they were sort of, and people like Virgil, they had Roman and Greek philosophers, poets, they were kind of groping their way towards Christianity. But of course, they couldn't get there until the incarnation occurs, So they were sort of, they had a nose for what was right, we might say. After the incarnation, Balthasar would say, the real battle of religions begins after the incarnation, because then you have to make a choice. Who do you say that Christ is? That's the question, okay? Now, most of the Communio people would say people like Marx not only got the answer wrong to that question, but their whole system is problematic because of its understanding of truth. And its understanding of truth is that it is something we create, and we create truth. We kind of manufacture our own truths, and they link in the context of those in the Marxian tradition. They always want to link truth to politics, and that's very problematic. And I've written an article on Joseph Ratzinger's comments about the Marxist tradition. And one of the interesting things about all the comments that Ratzinger makes about Marxism is that he doesn't actually zero in on the atheism. He zeroes in on this notion that truth is something we manufacture.
Yes, fascinating.
And so that's really interesting. But this major division is really whether you take contemporary social theory, whatever its provenance, and some contemporary social theories are okay, but you take contemporary social theory and you look at the teachings of the church and you try and make the teachings of the church either correlate to the contemporary social theory, or even worse, you want to change the church teaching because it doesn't somehow align with contemporary social theory. The alternative position, which is the Communio position, and also in the Anglican Church, the radical orthodoxy position, is to look at contemporary social theories and make a judgment of whether they're reliable or not with reference to the teaching, to the 2,000 years of Christian teaching, which comes through Scripture and tradition.
Yes,
You know,
yeah.
that's the big issue, I think.
It is, yeah, and so many things are going on, just sparking kind of things in my mind about how important that Christocentrism is. Like what you said about Christ does change all of reality. And I know you've quoted it in this book as well from John Paul II's Dominum et Vivificantem, paragraph 50, that through the incarnation, all of creation is transformed. Like he takes up not just only human flesh, but in a sense, everything. And that, and it's so hard, I think, for so many people to appreciate, because I think we do not only reduce it to a Marxian kind of truth to kind of, well, I suppose, politics and what we create, but also I think we reduce Christianity to morality as well through a Kantian kind of ethics. And you mentioned towards the end the importance of that Christianity is a humanism, not just the moral code, that Christ does transform everything. Like you said, it's the fundamental distinguishing kind of aspect. So
yeah, I think Kant's one of the biggest problems, really. I really do not like Kant, and he keeps popping up, as I go through life and I learn things. It's like, oh, he's behind that problem and he's behind that problem. The first thing he does is really separate faith and reason. He wants to put them in two separate baskets, and so he doesn't want people's faith contaminating their intellectual life. And that has had such an incredibly bad effect on intellectual life, especially in Germany, And the Germans have, I really believe they have the highest academic standards in the world, the most rigorous intellectual training, but they can also turn out some really stupid people because they want to always say, what I believe, what I think has nothing to do with any faith tradition,
And that stems from Kant.
It stems from Kant. And then, so Kant, he wants, Kant, Kant, you're right, you've got the right pronunciation. Kant wants to, he wants to separate faith and reason, but he wants to keep Christian morality. And so he tries to use reason alone to defend Christian morality. And that project completely fails. But by trying to do that, he creates the impression that Christianity is at best just a moral code. And a lot of people start thinking that way. And that's highly problematic because Christianity is primarily a relationship with the Holy Trinity. And from that flows a certain way of relating to other human beings, to animals, to the earth itself. We have a relationship to other humans. We have a relationship to other creatures in creation. We have a relationship to the planet. We are meant to be stewards of creation. All of that. So we do have a Christian ethical framework, but it all is downstream of this primary relationship with the Holy Trinity. And I think St. John Paul II really got that. And that's why at the beginning of his pontificate, his first encyclicals were all about what is the human person's relationship to Christ, what is the human person's relationship to God the Father, what is the human person's relationship to the Holy Spirit, And just to kind of go into sociology again.
Absolutely.
One of the really interesting sociological pieces of research that has been done on the 1960s and the student protest movements of 1968, the empirical research on that era shows that many of the student leaders who became Marxists and were protesting around the Sorbonne and other great universities of the world, they had all had strong Christian backgrounds. And a number of them had actually been either Catholic seminarians or Protestant students whatever.
Yes, yes, yep.
And so a French sociologist called Julie Pagis, Pagis, her research shows that if you came from a family where Christianity was perceived to be primarily a relationship with the Trinity, you were less likely to become a student radical
yes.
when you went to university, because you had this connection. You had a spirituality, you had a prayer life, you had if you were a Catholic, you had a sacramental life. But if you came from a family where Christianity was presented as a moral code, what happens is that you go to university, the whole sexual dimension of that moral code is not very attractive.
Yes, yes.
You know, the contraceptive
no,
pill,
no.
yeah, the contraceptive pill has arrived on the market, and you want to take advantage of that, and you think, well, you know, what's wrong with extramarital sexual intimacy if there's no danger of getting pregnant?
Yes.
So, you know, we're in a new era. We can take advantage of science. We can take the pill. We can have free love. We can stop being oppressed, repressed, and having Freudian style problems and all of that. And so we ditch the whole sexual morality side of Christianity. But we still think it's important to be moral. And so we ask ourselves, well, what bits of a moral code do we want? And suddenly Marxism provides us with a moral code. We have to liberate people in third world countries. We have to go around looking for victims of social injustice and liberate them. And that becomes our moral code.
That's fascinating.
And it's a kind of Marxian moral code. And so it's unsurprising that then we end up with these student leaders who completely ditch Christianity and start promoting various forms of Marxism. So that's an interesting fact. You know. But another thought I had when you talked about Christianity as an alternative humanism, what we call the humanism of the incarnation, is Friedrich Nietzsche's comment that if Christians want people to believe in their Christ, they should at least look redeemed.
Yes, yes.
And he even said, and they should have better hymns, you know?
Yes, yeah. Well, the Germans had pretty good hymns.
The Germans had pretty good hymns, but it's so interesting, you know.
And there's something incarnational about that, singing. You know, it's not an abstract moral code, yes.
So Nietzsche, you know, I feel sorry for Nietzsche because, you know, he grew up in this family where his dad died when he was young, and he had these maiden aunts who were puritanical Lutheran people, and that was his exposure to Christianity. And he somehow came across the works of Ignatius of Loyola. And in one of his letters to a friend, he actually says, you know, this Loyola chap, he's interesting. You know, he's really interesting, this guy.
Fascinating.
But he never quite lives long enough, I think, to really go down that rabbit hole. And the great German Jesuit, Erich Schwara,
because you wrote an article on this.
Yeah, I wrote an article on this. It was a rabbit hole that I really enjoyed exploring. Schwara was a big name German Jesuit in the first half of the 20th century.
And he taught one of the Communio founding trio in Balthasar. Did he teach?
He taught Balthasar. Yes. He taught lots of people. He taught everybody.
Yes, yeah. Wow.
He taught Rana. He taught Balthasar. He taught Edith Stein. You know,
yeah.
At least he was an advisor to Edith Stein. I'm not sure that she actually formally attended his classes. So he was a huge name, and Schwara was really fascinated by Nietzsche and said, look, from a Christian point of view, Nietzsche wrote a lot of anti-Christian stuff, but you have to understand that what he was attacking was Lutheran pietism and this sort of moralistic Christianity as a moral code, and in particular Christianity as a middle-class moral code, and that
the herd mentality.
The herd, for Nietzsche, the herd mentality is very much tied up with Protestant middle class respectability. And so Shavara says, you know, it's a shame he just didn't live long enough to explore Ignatian spirituality, because he may very well have, you know, ended up Catholic had he done that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It seems like Nietzsche actually got the point about the importance of humanism.
Yeah.
That he's, you know, Christianity, if you take it for what it claims to be, it can't be a moral code simply.
That's right.
You read the Bible, it's not, I mean, there is morality in it. Like you said, it flows downstream, but it's not primarily a text of aphoristic kind of propositions.
No.
It's a love story of a relationship with the Trinity. But I found that fascinating as, you know, you've broken down that connection between the reduction of a Christian humanism to morality in Kant, then provides a separation between faith and reason. And but then the Marxism comes into that divide to provide a way forward, but comes from Christianity. Then in the 60s, those had Catholic backgrounds. And it's I think you quote, correct me if I'm wrong, John Milbank, I think he's got a clever little quote that, you know, this breakdown occurred not because pipe-smoking men in Swedes kind of revolted against the church, but people in clerical grounds kind of went against themselves.
It's a comment he made in one of his Stanton lectures. It's a beautiful metaphor. He said, he was actually talking about the separation of nature and grace, which runs parallel to the separation of faith and reason. And he said it happens not because pipe-smoking men in tweed suits rebel against Christianity, but because the guys in the clerical collars created the separation. And they created the separation in the sort of 16th century because, well, one of the reasons they do it, there may have been multi-causes, but a major reason they did it is this: the fact that the Protestants, most of the Protestants, claimed that after the fall, human nature was totally corrupt, and the Catholics disagreed and said, no, after the incarnation, human nature was wounded, but not completely corrupt. And so what sort of happens in that period when you've got Catholics debating Protestants, there's this tendency to sort of focus on nature and the goodness of nature for the very good reason of wanting to defend the intrinsic goodness of human nature even after the fall. But in so doing, the whole dimension of grace sort of gets a bit sidelined. And then you know, we end up in this sort of crazy situation in the 20th century where people are trying to defend conceptions of natural law completely unhinged from the incarnation, from the divine law, you know, from any notion of a deity. You know, it's just, oh no, we can defend the idea of there being a natural law without any of the theological presuppositions. That's sort of where it all ends. And Milbank, I guess, was one of those who in the 20th century sort of said, look, natural law doesn't work unless you own up to the fact that, you know, you at least need the 10 Commandments, and the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you know. Yes. So that's a whole other debate, I suppose, but it's a great line by Milbank.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the, I think in your conclusion you speak of the main themes of Communio theology, and I think this is where it dovetails a bit with the radical orthodoxy, that there's no such thing as a theological neutral society. Is that ties over there?
I think that both the Communio theologians and people like John Milbank, who's the patriarch of British radical orthodoxy in the Anglican Communion, the thing that they sort of all agree upon is that there's no such thing as rationality that's neutral. You know, there's no pure reason.
like you were saying before, there's no such thing as pure nature.
Exactly. They're all on the same page in saying no pure nature, no pure reason. You know, we can't escape. We can't escape making a choice.
Yes, yes, and that just it comes back to that kind of Christocentric Trinitarian theology and the importance of relationship with the Father, Son, and Spirit. And you speak of Communio theology kind of in similar terms as not a theological system, but as a kind of constellation of relationships amongst friends. And I suppose, we could keep going down this track for ages. I'm just loving this. But maybe going back to those three founding figures. I mean, they were giants of the 20th century, and de Lubac, Balthasar, Ratzinger, intellectual kind of elite of the 20th century. Could you maybe just talk about their personalities and who they were?
Yeah. Well, the first one, the oldest of the three, was de Lubac, or Lubac, we should say. So he comes from a French aristocratic family, hence the DE before the Lubac. And just as a technical point of etiquette, it was explained to me once by the late Fergus Carr, the Dominican, that Anglophones constantly make this social faux pas. When they cite someone with an aristocratic name, they usually include the nobiliary particle. So they say de Lubac or von Balthasar, okay? And that's wrong. You are not, when you talk about someone with an aristocratic name, you drop the nobiliary particle if you don't use their first name. So it's either Hans von Balthasar, or simply Balthasar, or Henri de Lubac, or simply Lubac. Okay. So anyway, that's just a point of etiquette. If you're ever in a social situation in Rome,
don't get caught.
in Rome, or any other part of Europe, especially I would say in France or Germany, where they really care about etiquette.
Take note.
Take note. Yeah. Anyway, so the eldest of the three of the trio, whom incidentally the American Jesuit Joseph Fezio, who founded Ignatius Press, he calls them the Neo-Cappadocian Trio. Beautiful. Okay, so he says, just as in the 4th century you had Saint Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzen, sorting out these intellectual problems in the life of the 4th century church. In the 20th century, you had these three. Okay, so anyway, de Lubac, French aristocratic family. I can't remember the number of siblings, but I think it was 5. It might have been 7. But he came from this really happy Catholic family. He has said beautiful things about his parents and how happily married they were, and how his mother had been educated in some convent in France, and so she was like intelligent but pious at the same time. It's clearly a family where they've got high level of education, but also a high level of emotional intelligence, and there's a kind of integration of the affective and the cognitive. So lovely childhood. But then World War I breaks out. So he ends up on the front in World War I. He's shot in the head with a bullet, somehow survives. But as a consequence, he has headaches for the rest of his life. Because of this, his Dean of Studies in the seminary says, you don't have to go to lectures every day, but instead you have to read your way through the entire patristic collection, like it's a couple of 100 volumes.
Mammoth job.
Mammoth job. And most of it was still in the patristic language. It's not in French.
So it's Greek and Latin, more or less.
Yeah. So he does that. And then he eventually gets through all of that. And then he gets to the medievals. And when he starts reading Aquinas, he can see how Aquinas has appropriated different ideas from the patristic authors. But when he gets beyond the medievals and gets into the Baroque period, the 16th century, he starts thinking, wait up, there's a problem here. You know, your 16th century understanding of 13th century Thomism is problematic, you know. And so de Lubac develops this theory that secularism is a problem and has developed in Western culture in part because of moves that are made on the chessboard in the 16th century, especially this very sharp separation of nature and grace, which is what John Milbank believes.
Yes.
What he meant about the men in clerical collars getting it wrong. So one of de Lubac's big contributions is simply saying, we've got to revisit our understanding of the relationship between nature and grace. Another of his great contributions is his ecclesiology, where he wants to emphasise that the church is like a symphony of different sacramental relationships. And, you know, the notion of the church as the body of Christ and the bride of Christ is something that de Lubac really amplifies.
And up to that point, what would be the main metaphor when he's writing, or what it'd be a more legalistic kind
I think
of
there was
structure?
a more legalistic kind of
conception
emphasis.
of the church. Yeah. Okay.
So it wasn't as though de Lubac or Lubac wasn't as if he
We're not
kind
in France or
we're
Germany.
not in France
so.
or Germany. It's okay. Yeah, even in the United States, it's funny because when I try and explain this to Americans, often their reaction is, "Oh, we don't care about what they do."
In Europe, on the continent.
You know, we don't care.
We revolted against them after all.
Exactly. We'll just continue to save on Balthasar and de Lubac. Yeah. Lubac didn't discover these ideas of the bride of Christ and the body of Christ, but he did kind of explore what that means. And one could say that a lot of Lubac's theology comes up in Lumen Gentium. The sort of vision of the church we get in Lumen Gentium is very Lubatian. So
he's got nature and grace,
and
ecclesiology
are his two big
contributions.
His two big contributions, and also being in charge of a major project to translate many of the patristic volumes into French.
That's the resource
That's
mod?
the resource mod project.
And which means, up to that stage, a lot of them weren't translated or used the patristic words?
At that point, a lot of them hadn't been translated.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he did a lot of that
He
work.
he oversaw a project which did a lot of the translation work.
So he's the godfather, you would say, of the three?
He's the godfather of the three, yeah. He's called, I think, the Great Old Man.
The great old.
Somebody called him the Great Old Man. Can't remember who did.
In French. What was Grand? Yeah.
Grand, yeah. So he's the first of them. Then Balthasar. Balthasar's Swiss, and he comes from another one of these aristocratic families. His dad was a church architect. His mother was in charge of the Swiss League of Catholic Women. His sister Renee grew up to become a general of a Franciscan order of nuns. So, okay, if you're the general, it means you're in charge of the entire order worldwide. His brother Dieter was a Swiss guard, and his uncle Vilmos Apor is now Blessed Vilmos Apor, the Hungarian bishop who was martyred at the end of the Second World War. And that's his family, you know. And
not a bad pedigree.
Not a bad pedigree. And it's said that in the family they spoke 4 languages, just, you know, over the dinner table. I guess in Switzerland that's not uncommon.
Yes.
And then he checked himself out of secondary school because he was bored, and went to university, and he becomes a Jesuit. So his spirituality is very Ignatian. He never loses that. His doctorate is on the Apocalypse in German, in the world of German letters.
Wow.
So that theme of the Apocalypse, but in German philosophy and German literature. You know,
Like the book of the Apocalypse, or the idea of
the idea.
Yeah, okay.
The idea. So he's, yeah. I look, when I look at his doctorate, I think he sort of does something similar to what Shavara did to the notion of humanitas. So Shavara has this big chunky book of about 900 pages, looking at what a whole range of German authors had thought about human nature. And Shavara also looks at a few of the Russians as well. Yes. And I think what Balthasar does is just to comb through all the great names in German literature and philosophy and say, how did they understand the Apocalypse? And that's really a kind of question about theological anthropology. And so he does that as his doctoral project. And he ends up, he ends up becoming a spiritual director of somebody called Adrienne von Speer, who is a convert from some kind of Swiss Protestantism. She's a mystic. She experiences the Passion of Christ every Easter. Wow. You know, she's a whole category, all of her own. But he decides that together they will found a new ecclesial movement, which becomes the Johannes Gemeinschaft. It's a very intellectual group that is focused on theology and publishing theological works. So he ends up doing that, and he produces this great kind of collection of 3 volumes, I think it's 14 or 15 volumes of theology, but divided into 3 sections. One section focused on truth, a presentation of the Catholic faith from the perspective of the transcendental of truth, then one whole suite of books or volumes on the presentation of the Catholic faith from the perspective of goodness, and then finally beauty. Actually, it's the other way around. So it's beauty first, goodness second, and truth at the end. And this is one of a key Balthasarian ideas, that he thought that Catholic apologetics, catechetics, had been focused on a presentation of the faith as the truth. And he certainly believes it is the truth. But he thought that many people actually find their way to Christianity not via the transcendental property of truth, but via the transcendental property of beauty. And that's something that one of the 20th century Dominicans also argued. He talked about there being a gate of truth and a gate of goodness and a gate of beauty into the church, and that many people come in through the gate of beauty. And beauty doesn't only mean, say, the beautiful artwork or beautiful solemn liturgies. It can also be something like the beauty of Catholic family life. You know, it can be attractive to people. So Balthasar said we must attend to all 3 transcendentals, and he thought that for a lot of people, beauty is the one they kind of get easy, most easiest,
most tactile, and I mean Bishop Barron's modus operandi is kind of
the whole modus operandi of Word on Fire is beauty first, goodness, then truth. Not saying one is more important than the other, but saying when you're trying to re-evangelize a holy, not a holy in HOLY, but like a culture that has been entirely secularized, when you're trying to re-evangelize that culture, one has to pay attention to the transcendental of beauty and goodness. And then when people get that, then you can sort of give them the intellectual framework, and all the pieces of the jigsaw finally fit together.
And it seems like it's the most kind of going back to that incarnational principle or humanism, that beauty is the closest to the flesh, it seems. I don't know if I'm...
Yeah, I think that's
maybe,
a fair point.
yeah.
Another chap, Father Benedict Groeschel, who was the founder of one of the new Franciscan movements in the United States in the 20th century. He was renowned as a spiritual director. And he argued that every person has a primary transcendental. So he said, it's like a Catholic theory of personality types. And he said, everyone will find one of those transcendentals easier to understand than the others. And he gave as examples, he said St. Thomas Aquinas was clearly a truth type, you know, and even the Dominicans have as their motto, veritas.
Yes.
If you go to any Dominican institution, you know, there's veritas written everywhere, okay. So Aquinas and most Dominicans, when you meet them, they'll be into truth. That's their transcendental, their primary transcendental. He said, St. Augustine, it's beauty, you know. And so you'll often find with Benedictines, because of the importance of liturgy for their spirituality, because their whole lives are really devoted to liturgy, beauty is often really, really important for a Benedictine. And then Groeschel said the Franciscans often have goodness as their primary transcendental. To be a saint, you've got to be into all three, obviously.
And they're mutually implicative, aren't
They're mutually, the word is circumincessive. It's like a Trinitarian relationship between them. And there are lots of these Trinitarian relationships. So there's like truth, beauty and goodness, faith, hope and love, you know, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, where we look at how all of creation has been marked by the form of the Trinity.
Yes,
you know. That's really interesting too. But in terms of spiritual direction, in terms of the re-evangelization of a largely secularized culture, it's important to understand that, you know, if someone's primary transcendental is beauty, you don't take them to a rubbish liturgy with, you know, banal hymns, for example, or, you know, somebody's pressing a button on a computer to generate
playlist
to present some kind of YouTube playlist. You don't do that if they're primary transcendental.
Even if it is ad-free.
Even if it is ad-free, yeah. And similarly, you know, if someone is a person for whom truth is their primary transcendental, well, you can give them a book by a Catholic theologian. They'll probably read it, you know. But if they're a goodness type, they probably won't read the book by the Catholic theologian. But if you show them a functional Catholic community where people are caring for each other and being virtuous, being kind, being loving, that might attract them, you know. So
that's beautiful. Thank you. So Balthasar gives us the three.
He gives us
transcendentals.
He gives us the emphasis on the transcendentals. He gives us two things, I would say: the emphasis on the transcendentals, and a really deep understanding of the bad moves that have been made in German philosophy. Okay, so he is across all the big names in German philosophy. And the moves they have made and how those intellectual moves have had a bad effect on Christian culture, how they have contributed to the secularization of Western culture and to pathologies we now associate with the cultures of modernity and post-modernity. You know, he's been in the laboratory. He grew up in that kind of world of intellectual Germany and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland, and he's seen it all from the inside.
Yeah, it's fascinating. He's a great genealogist, and I remember at this conference in Chicago on Shavada, and the question that was really striking me was what is the German spirit? Because you get these two dialectically opposed kind of seemingly principles, something like, you know, you've got Hegel's kind of abstract Geist, but then you've got this kind of blood and toil from below, which expresses itself in Nazism.
Yes.
And so how do you, and I've always found it fascinating, these, like you mentioned earlier, they've got the highest kind of intellectual capacity or measure in terms of their institutions, but then you see this dark, I mean, you could, I suppose it's in every human heart really, but there, I don't know, is there something particular about this? I mean, this might be another rabbit hole.
That's another rabbit hole. And I think it is a really good question that hasn't been properly explored. I think it's a question that the post-World War II generation of Germans asked themselves. But unfortunately, the answer they followed was provided by the Frankfurt School, by people like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. They wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. And they say, the problem with Germany is, yes, it's the intellectual elite of Germany, but what they saw as problematic about the intellectual elite of Germany for the past couple of centuries was their respect for authority and their interest in reason. So, you know, and so unfortunately what really happens with that 1960s generation is that their takeaway from the Frankfurt School is reason's bad, authority is bad.
Because of the experience of World War II?
Because of the experience, because that generation, they needed a narrative to explain how could our parents and grandparents go along with this, you know, evil? How could they do that? And so they needed a narrative that could explain how that could have happened. And the narrative they accept largely as a generation is that of the Frankfurt School and their critique of rationality, their critique of authoritarian systems of governance. So you end up with a situation where suddenly a generation thinks it's wrong to have a hierarchical church. You know, so they want to democratize the church. And they see reason as bad. They see rationality as bad. So they want to kind of play up human emotions and feelings, and then what becomes good is not being truthful or rational, but being authentic to yourself. You know, so we have all of these developments. But I think what still needs to be offered is a Catholic account of, you know, what really went wrong in German cultural life. You know, and I think in part Balthasar tried to answer that, but I don't think he did so in a popular book that would sell thousands of copies. You know, and one of Balthasar's ideas was that Goethe, although he wasn't a Catholic, he had some good ideas, and if the German people had followed Goethe rather than Kant, things would not have ended up in Auschwitz. That's a sort of Balthasarian idea. But I think once you say you can't bring Christian revelation into any kind of integrated relationship with philosophy, once you take that position, I think you are on this slippery slope to the idolatry of the intellectual. You know, you end up turning your intellectuals into gods, and those intellectuals are completely unfettered from Christian revelation, and then they just come up with crazy ideas.
Yeah, well, it's a Luciferian temptation, isn't it?
It's a Luciferian temptation.
The high, you know, what is it? The corruption of the highest is the worst, and I think that's and I think, going back to the importance of Christ. I mean, Barron says, you know, Christ frames. What's
Bishop Barron says, the fundamental question is, does Christ position culture or does culture position Christ? Now, those concilium types we talked about earlier, who wanted to correlate the faith to the culture of modernity, they were allowing the culture to position Christ. And I think that was a fundamental error. Even though it was well-intentioned, I think it was fundamentally an error. And Bishop Barron would see that as a fundamental error. And, you know, the alternative is you make Christ the centre. He positions culture.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is like a lack of hope. Like if you think you despair that Christ has the capacity to to be the centre of culture, can he still speak to us today? You know, a lot of people despair of that, I think. So Balthasar, going back to Balthasar, he gives us the 3 transcendentals and a genealogy of the German spirit, you would say, or the
absolutely.
And then staying on another German, your
my favourite one.
Okay.
He's my favourite, but the others are great. So Ratzinger, what can we say about Ratzinger?
You've written quite a few books.
I've written quite a few books about Ratzinger, and I think what he gives us is a fundamental theology. Okay, so people who don't like Ratzinger, people who were very much of the view that we need the culture to position Christianity and so forth, those who took that trajectory, they often put Ratzinger down by saying, he didn't create his own systematic theology. Well, he didn't have time to, apart from anything else. But I think what he did do, his publications number over 5 million words.
5 million words, wow.
Over 5 million words.
How many do you know how many you've had published?
No, I
Be
don't.
worth a count.
So what he does, this is a really cheesy metaphor, but I often think of him as being a bit like Smokey the Bear. If you watch that Smokey the Bear cartoon, Smokey's in a national park and there are spot fires occurring all over the national park, and Smokey goes out and he puts out the fire. Okay, I think in the biography of Joseph Ratzinger, he finds himself in the centre of almost every big theological debate in the church in the 20th century. And so he's like going around putting out spot fires, putting out theological spot fires. But he doesn't do it by just exercising his authority and crushing some theological position he doesn't like. He actually examines the issue and tries to work out, well, what is promoting this idea, or how are people getting this idea, or how does this pastoral crisis arise? What are the intellectual drivers behind the pastoral crisis or the intellectual crisis? And then he kind of offers his theological pathology report. And from that you can extract his principles of a fundamental theology.
And sorry, just to take a step back, a fundamental theology, for those who don't know what that is, how would you explain what fundamental theology is?
I would say that one can think of Catholic theology as being like a Gothic cathedral, where you have foundation stones, you've got certain structural pillars that have to be there for the whole thing to fit together and hold together. And at the very basis, at the very foundation, there are what I call the critical couplets. So there's nature and grace, faith and reason, history and dogma, history and ontology, Trinitarian relationships and Christology, ecclesiology and Marian theology. There are all of these different little couplets, and depending upon how you understand their relationship, you will end up with a different looking cathedral.
Yes, or a wonky one. Or
you could end up with a Liverpool wigwam if you're not careful, So
no thanks.
So when we talk about fundamental theology, we mean the building blocks. How do we understand scripture and tradition, nature and grace, all of these little building blocks? And I think what Ratzinger does in the 5 million words he's published, he offers us his understanding of what the correct relationship is between those different couplets. And probably the biggest contribution would be the scripture and tradition couplet, I would say, is his biggest contribution. But one of my future projects, if I have enough time, I might try and say, okay, well, let's produce a book explaining Ratzinger's fundamental theology. And maybe rather than writing it myself, I might write one chapter and then get people who are excellent on different couplets to write the different chapters. So, for example, Father Aaron Pidell, who's at the Gregorian, he's an American Jesuit. I think he's written a brilliant book on how Ratzinger relates scripture and tradition. I just think it's brilliant. It's published by Catholic University of America Press, so I wouldn't be writing that chapter. I'd get him to write that chapter. And I'd farm out the different couplets to different people. That's how I think I would do it. But I think you can get a complete fundamental theology out of the works of Ratzinger. And I truly believe that's what we need in order to resolve many of the disagreements within the church, the tensions, the conflicts within the church. I don't believe in, grabbing a whole lot of people who run Catholic church agencies and putting them in a room and saying, what do you think? No, I don't think that's the way.
What doesn't he say as well, like a collaborative document is always a flattened document as well? It's like the greatest kind of works in any domain in history, always from individuals who are...
Absolutely. He recognised that during the Nazi period, if the German bishops all got together and tried to produce something, it was a weak document, But you've got someone like a Clemens August Graf von Galen, who's just standing up in his pulpit and thundering away and taking them on the line of Munster, And in the end, it's the line of Munster who comes out of that whole era as the German Catholic hero, or one of the German Catholic heroes, So, and my personal experience is... I'm a really bad committee person because it's so frustrating. You'll have some people on the committee who can write really well and they produce something that's fantastic, and then some other people on the committee have their personal pet issues, and then the document gets watered down to satisfy someone's personal pet issue. And like the end result, it's always, in my personal experience, every time I've been on a committee, the document that has been produced has been something that's dumbed down to the lowest common denominator of agreement. And it's kind of banal. The number of banal ecclesial documents I have read.
And inconsequential at the end of the day. It's frustrating. But so you recommend obviously Ratzinger's work, which is not the fruit of a committee. But also just on that comment, because one of your previous books I think really touches upon this, is it Unconformed to the Age, where you really kind of, with that, maybe just to flag that.
Unconformed to the Age is my sort of book of ecclesiological essays. And it was written at the height of the kind of enthusiasm for synodality. And what I did was... I translated some of Ratzinger's material on this topic because the Germans had their own kind of first experience of this contemporary version of synodality, which is very different from previous versions of synodality. With previous versions, there would certainly be a synod, but you would invite people who had some experience about the topic under the discussion. So if it's going to be a synod on Eucharistic theology, you get all the best Eucharistic theology professors, But this contemporary kind of form of synodality is you just you kind of just get random people who, they might occupy a position as, say, school principal or CEO of a Catholic hospital or whatever, and then they find themselves in a meeting and then being asked to say what they think about, theological topics for which they have had no educational background.
And they feel uncomfortable themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think one of the difficulties I find is the kind of unmet expectations, because the frame isn't actually set. And so many people walk out disappointed because they're, often promised the world and given not much at all,
I know.
or flattened documents.
Documents. And so Ratzinger was dealing, in the 1970s, he was dealing with this situation in Catholic Germany where people were saying, hierarchies are bad, we've got to democratise the church. And so we have this big synod.
And this is still kind of connecting it, sorry to cut you off, but just to connect it to something you were saying before with Horkheimer and Adorno, the authoritarian self with a breakdown on authority of truth. This is kind of a fruit of that in the 70s or so?
It's a fruit of that in the 70s.
Yep.
And some people, like Ratzinger, thought, this is all a bad move. And he pointed out that if you want to democratise the church, first of all, he thought you can't, because Ratzinger believed that the structures were actually created by Christ. That a bishop is something and a priest is something and a layperson is something else, and the relationships between them and their authority is something that Christ foreordained, and we can't make it up for ourselves.
And that goes back to that question: does Christ center culture, or does culture center Christ?
Exactly.
Is what Christ says consequential or not?
Exactly. But so that would be the first theological point that Ratzinger would make, is that we don't create the church. It's not ours to create. It's not a club. It's not a political party. But the second point he would make is a sociological point, and that is, when you democratise, you bureaucratise. Okay, democracy and bureaucracy go together. So if you want to democratise the church, you end up creating bureaucracies. And Ratzinger argued that actually lay people have more authority in the church if they don't have to battle their way through bureaucracies.
Yes.
So it's a really interesting sociological point. If you want to, for example, if you take the view that parish priests have too much authority, usually what you conclude is that you need to create a parish council, and that the priest needs to be, his powers need to be circumscribed by the parish council. Now, once that happens, if you're a lay person, you suddenly find yourself with another dozen authority figures.
Yes, exactly. It becomes more complicated.
It becomes more complicated. And a good parish priest would have enough common sense to say, I need to take advice from my parishioners, And a good parish priest, if he's no good at economics or finance or something, he'd find the top accountant in the parish and say, you help here, Intelligent priests and intelligent bishops should be able to identify the laity who are skilled in certain areas and take advice from them. And if they don't, they usually end up being beaten up anyway. If they sort of think I'm brilliant and my powers are unlimited, and you've got some guy with an ego problem in a position of authority, usually the lay people will get sick of that.
Yes.
And so they'll band together and kind of
do
a bit of panel beating.
Yes.
So I think the really interesting sociological point is, if you want to democratise, you end up bureaucratising, and that just it diffuses the power.
Yes.
And diffusing the power is not necessarily a good thing, because then usually nothing gets done, or everything gets done in a kind of half-hearted, compromise sort of way, which makes nobody happy.
Yeah. I think the externalization of responsibility, like I think it's a breakdown often between authority and responsibility. You know, if authority's all bad, that breaks down. So then responsibility is, is externalized, but then no one's guilty if it goes wrong.
That's right.
There's a bit of a side comment, but I think it's apt. There's the story in the gospel where they try to take Jesus off the cliff and he slips through the crowd. Yeah. Apparently, I was reading one scholar and they were saying that the crowd would band together side by side and they'd walk towards whoever to knock them over. But then who killed him? Nobody. And that's the comment that he was able to slip through because they were all joined together. But I think that's, it's an interesting, there's no accountability. And we all hear this problem. But so Ratzinger makes that, sociological point between democracy and bureaucracy is a fascinating one. So, and he's the fundamental theologian. He's, we need to go back to his works to try and discover the problems, the fault lines in the church today, in the world today more generally. What else has he kind of, maybe more about himself? He's a German and he lived through a lot of these issues.
He was born in 1927, so it's his centenary next year, so there'll be lots of events around the world to celebrate his birth. He was sort of recruited into the German army at the end of the Second World War, of course. He had no choice about that. And he didn't actually do any fighting. He spent most of his time actually in an American prisoner of war camp, I think. Yeah, he did end up in a US prisoner of war camp in Ulm, ULM. And he deserted towards the end and was lucky not to be executed for desertion. I think I have a memory that he had his arm in a sling or something and sort of got away with it on those grounds. But he deserts towards the end and finds his way home. And then in 1946, so the year after the war ends, he enters the seminary. He's at the University of Munich at a period in time when there are lots of great professors, and he obviously, is a beneficiary of having been in the right place at the right time, where there was just a great constellation of brilliant professors, including at that time Romano Guardini was there. And then he comes to the attention of Cardinal Frings of Cologne and goes to the Second Vatican Council when he's only 35 years old as a theological advisor. And then, he ends up becoming the Bishop of Munich, Freising, and then a very significant thing is that the German philosopher Joseph Pieper hears Karol Wojtyła at a conference, at a philosophy conference. And Pieper, who was a friend of Ratzinger's, writes to Ratzinger and says, I listened to this Polish guy and he's a philosopher, and I think the two of you should get to know each other, and maybe you should send him a copy of your best-selling work, Introduction to Christianity, which is anything but an introduction. For those who've read No Ratzinger, do not start with the Introduction to Christianity. Yes. Start with the Jesus of Nazareth trilogy. Anyway, Ratzinger sends Wojtyła a copy of Introduction to Christianity, and then Wojtyła becomes Pope, and then Wojtyła brings Ratzinger to Rome and gives him every top academic job in Rome. He makes him prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He puts him in charge of the Biblical Commission. He's also in charge of the International Theological Commission by virtue of his position at the CDF. So he kind of gives him all the intellectual jobs in Rome, except prefect for the Congregation for Catholic Ed. He didn't have that, but he's pretty much for a quarter of a century then having to deal with the theological problems in the life of the church.
Yeah, remarkable. And then he himself becomes...
Then he himself becomes Pope.
Yes, yeah, wonderful. So these three giants of the church of the 20th century have really shaped Communio theology from the establishment of the journal in 1972. And your book is a kind of a summation, I would say. It's a great synthesis of the last 50 years, beginning grounded on that. Where is Communio theology going? Are there giants like those three today in the world, do you think, or institutions that you could recommend, aside from your own work?
Look, you know, my work is just kind of putting together the ideas of the giants and showing how they relate to contemporary pastoral issues. That's what I think I do, and I think I'm a pretty okay intellectual historian.
Absolutely.
I like chasing rabbits down burrows and finding out who influenced whom, who studied under whom. Like how do you produce a Ratzinger? Looking at all the different relationships and the tributaries of ideas. You know, I like all of that, and so I probably have developed some skill in that area. But in terms of the giants, I think that generation that Ratzinger belonged to, in fact, the whole first half of the 20th century, I think it produced what are called virtuoso performers in the theological world. And I just don't see that we have the kind of culture to produce those virtuoso performers today. That's my sense.
Sure.
You know, first of all, you need to begin with, you need people growing up in families where they speak 4 or 5 languages.
Even, what you mentioned, of the three, they all came from rich Catholic families, rich and culturally.
Culturally rich Catholic families. And, you know, so a young Ratzinger, although he's the one of the 3 that didn't come from an aristocratic family, his dad was a policeman, but he was sent to a school where in Germany they have a distinction between schools that are designed to produce academics and other schools. So he went to a gymnasium, and that has got nothing to do with athletics. In fact, he would have completely failed. He wasn't interested in sport. A gymnasium in the German world is a school that is designed to produce academics. And he would study, you know, Greek and Latin as a matter of course, you know, in those early primary school years.
Yeah, wow.
And so you need really to start in the kindergarten level. You need lots of languages, lots of exposure to literature and history, and then when you get to the undergraduate years, you need to study like the history of philosophy. You know, not just Plato and Aristotle, but you need to know the whole panoramic vision of philosophy, and I guess then you need people who have a really rich faith life. So they can't have grown up in parishes where the soil, so to speak, using that metaphor, was, you know, low grade rocky soil. You know, I had lunch with somebody yesterday who described the soil of her Catholic primary school education and secondary school education. I couldn't repeat the adjectives she used to describe it, but it was very bad.
Very low grade.
Very low grade, you know. And it amused me a great deal because I thought, that's this problem. You know, we have many people who just get thrown onto the rocky ground, and there's no rich culture, no rich Catholic culture to form them. And so I think it'll be some time before we start producing more of these virtuoso performers. I think we're now in a period really of where we've got to consolidate the best of the last century,
Yes.
and try and hand that on. So I think we have to go back, in fact, to the 19th century, to people like Sheben, to people like Newman, and then move forward into the 20th century to the Neo-Cappadocian Trio, and try and provide sort of courses on their works, so that the next generation are really immersed in Newman, really immersed in Lubach, Balthasar, Ratzinger, Sheben, and, you know, the great medievals, Aquinas, Bonaventure, the whole patristic tradition, the Basils and the Augustines, and also, you know, there are some great scholars in the Russian Orthodox tradition, and we should be open to that as well, in the Greek Orthodox tradition. So
there's great hope. I mean, like you said, there's a transformation of culture that's needed towards the culture of the incarnation, based upon the rich kind of familial soil, which is Catholic, and from which to look at 19th century, 20th century, going forward with reading these texts. And I remember one talk that you gave, I think whether you finished with it, but you said, keep calm and read Ratzinger.
That's one of my memes.
Yes,
yeah. I think it's a good meme, really.
I think so, yeah.
I think Ratzinger, you know, he was the subject of a lot of negative publicity, and a large number of people have said to me that they didn't read him for a long time because they thought, oh, he was just some reactionary and, you know, some German fascist type who put people down if they didn't have the same ideas as himself. And then finally, somehow they have to engage with some part of his work, and they discover, no, he's actually not like that at all. You know, when one reads Ratzinger, he always explains the position he is arguing against. He always, like Aquinas, presents the argument he doesn't approve of in its best possible light, and then explains why he doesn't agree with it. And so it's not just a use of authority. It's not just, you know, I am a bishop, I have said, I have decreed, or I'm a cardinal, I have said, I have decreed. There's always an argument.
He believes in truth.
He believes in truth, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And your work, I find, mirrors that as well, your capacity to synthesize thought, but also to go deeply down and find the genealogy of not only ideas, but people, where they come from and so forth, for which I'm very much grateful to you for. And maybe to conclude with, where can we, you know, buy your books, and what's a good place? I mean, I'll just lift this one up again. I highly recommend people to buy this book, Introducing Communio Theology. But what other books or places can we look at your work? And what would you recommend starting with from your own?
Okay. Well, all of my books are available on Amazon, or they're available, easily available in Catholic bookstores. Yes. So they're not hard to get a hold of. I think the number's now 13.
13 books.
I think there's now 13.
And articles?
There's now over 200 articles.
200 articles on various publications.
Yeah, yes. And most of the articles, I would say 95% of them, are available on my website, on the University of Notre Dame website. Yes. So if you just Google Tracey Rowland and University of Notre Dame, you know, my publication list comes up. Yeah. In terms of my books, the one that has sold the most copies and has been translated into the most languages is Ratzinger's Faith. So it's like Ratzinger for anyone who's had a Year 12 education.
Okay, yes.
and then there's another one that was published in the Bloomsbury's Guide for the Perplexed series, but that's really a more high-level introduction to Ratzinger. The Bloomsbury editor joked that the Ratzinger's Faith book, which was published by Oxford University Press, was Ratzinger for mice, and the Bloomsbury one is Ratzinger for rats. So they're both introductory, but one's pitched at a higher level. I have a collection of just op-ed pieces I've published in Catholic newspapers, and that's called Portraits of Spiritual Nobility. And some people read that and love that. And then sadly they'll go and buy one of the academic books and discover, oh no.
Give me more of the previous one.
Give me more of the previous one. So the portraits one is just a collection of op-ed pieces. And I like that because usually they're things like obituaries for people who taught me, and or fun pieces of some kind or another. On ecclesiology, the Unconformed to the Age book is my best collection of ecclesiological essays, and where I get to sort of tell the world how much I don't like bureaucracy.
So, yes.
And
I don't think you're alone in that regard.
And then I would also say my book with the boring title, Catholic Theology, is, I think, really helpful for people who are about to go into a seminary and do a BTheol. It's coming out again in a second edition this year, so it's been updated. In fact, we're just waiting on one thing, and that is Pope Leo's first encyclical.
Okay.
So there's a rumour going around that it will be out in May.
In May, okay.
So, in the next month it should appear.
Do you know what the topic is?
The rumour is that it will be called Magnifica Humanitas. And that it will be about the dignity of the human person and how technology can undermine that, including artificial information, artificial intelligence. So that's the rumour, okay? But we need to be able to put that first encyclical of Leo's into an appendix, which has got all the encyclicals since Leo XIII. So we want everything from Leo XIII to Leo XIV. So there's that one tiny bit of the jigsaw that is remaining to be placed into position. But the thing about that book, Bishop Barron has said it's got a bad title, but I didn't choose the title. It was in a Bloomsbury series, and there's Lutheran theology, Anglican theology, Calvinist theology, and mine was the Catholic theology volume. But what I do is to say, look, if you go to a Catholic academy, if you're enrolled in a BTheol somewhere, the chances are that your lecturers will not all follow the same fundamental theology, So you could have lecturers who are liberation theologians, you could have lecturers who are concilium types, you could have lecturers who are one of any 18 subspecies of Thomists I identified, or you could have a Communio lecturer, That's just the biggest options on the smorgasbord. So in that book, I try to explain, well, if you've got a Communio lecturer, what will be some of their theological presuppositions? If you've got a liberation theologian, what are some of their key ideas? If you've got a Thomist, you need to know what species of Thomist it is, and I identified 18 different species. So that book is really helpful, I think, for people who are embarking upon the study of theology.
Wonderful. So, that's marvellous. Thank you so much. So as a way in, you'd probably, for those who want an easy way in, Portrait of Christian Nobility would be
That's the fun one.
The fun one. So, but no, that was really, really, really quite helpful. And I just want to thank you for everything that you do, for your intellectual generosity and your labour of love in everything you do. And thank you for writing this book. Like I said, I highly recommend everyone to buy it.
And support, the whole Word on Fire Bishop Barron project, I think, because
it's a lovely product.
Yeah.
Lovely copy.
Everything they do is top quality because of the emphasis upon beauty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Father Olek.
Bless you.